Greetings. My apologies first for not being there in person as I am doing field work in the Arctic related to this topic of the green energy transition and different ways of resourcing this through metals, particularly. My contact details are there, and I hope that we will engage further on social media and other mechanisms related to this important topic. So first of all, let's just consider what are the possible sources of technology metals. And I have put these forward with reference to how some of the most polarized debates around deep sea mining are configured. First, there's terrestrial mining in areas where there is competing human use for agriculture and other sources. There's also mining where there may not be human use but compromised biodiversity. We have coastal mining underwater but within national waters. And this often gets erroneously conflated with deep sea mining, such as what happened with the Nautilus project in Papua New Guinea. And then there is oceanic mining in the deep sea, in international waters, which is what I believe is the primary topic of the panel today. And then, of course, the other source, which is very important and we should ultimately all be moving towards, is recycled sources of metals and a circular economy. So I approach this topic as someone who's studied environmental conflicts for the past 20 years or so, with a particular focus on mining and extractive industries. This is a paper we wrote about 9 years ago, which looked at the cost of conflict to mining projects. These are terrestrial mining projects. And it is absolutely astounding how unpopular the mining industry is, especially when we consider how important minerals are for our daily lives. But basically, what we found in this paper was that there is a very tangible financial cost to conflict around mining on land, and it comes from highly contested uses of land. And the single biggest risk to any mining project on land is conflict, whether it is opposition from local communities or international networks of highly funded activists now, particularly in the last 10 years, very well resourced activism against mining. Now, some of that very well intentioned activism comes from very genuine and understandable concerns around biodiversity on land. And this is some work we published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society in 2018, which found that a lot of mineral deposits are coincident on land with high biodiversity areas. So we have this nexus between biodiversity and mining resources, which also leads to further conflict from activist circles with their good intentions, certainly. So I came to look at deep sea mining precisely because there was such an impasse with reference to terrestrial mining and all the concerns, having done a lot of field work with indigenous communities all over the world. I found deep sea mining as a potential opportunity where you did not have cultural sites and displaced populations and child labor and a lot of those concerns which had confounded much of the terrestrial mining enterprise. So that's how I became involved in this research when I was invited to work on this particular article, which was published in the Journal of Cleaner Production 2020, which was the first detailed study analyzing, using life cycle analysis, the difference in waste generation and carbon footprint between terrestrial mining and deep sea mining. The first part of the study, the one published in the Journal of Cleaner Production, focused more on the carbon footprint, and the results showed that in general, the carbon footprint of deep sea mining was much less than terrestrial mining. So here is further data, which is presenting also the amount of waste material, comparing the different kinds of metal ores. This was published in the Journal of Industrial Ecology last year, also a very highly ranked peer-reviewed journal. So when we talk about biodiversity concerns, clearly this is the most difficult part of the comparison between deep sea and terrestrial mining. It's important to consider that deep sea mining itself has three different kinds of terrains below the sea that we're talking about. So you've got hydrothermal vents, which are these marvelous ecosystems that you've probably seen on National Geographic and so on, with these large, colorful worms and amazing volcanic activity around black smokers and so on. Clearly, those are very unique ecosystems, and no one is suggesting mining active hydrothermal vents. And although extinct vents have been noted as possible sources of minerals, I personally would not recommend dealing with those areas either, because they do have some very unique characteristics. The second area is the sea mounts or cobalt rich crusts, which are more elevated parts of the ocean. And there also there are genuine concerns around biodiversity, and you have also a trophic zone where light can penetrate, and you can get quite a high level of biodiversity at various levels, and also competition with fish. However, the third area is the polymetallic nodules, which is in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, the CCZ, which is where most of the deep sea mining conversations and debates are happening. So that's the area where we should be thinking about what are the parameters under which biodiversity concerns could potentially be met, partly because there's no phytodiversity there. And so we have tried to evaluate what would be the way forward for that. So here's a diagram from a paper which we have just published within the last few weeks in March of this year. And this is led by Steve Katona, who was the co-founder of the Ocean Health Index that was administered by Conservation International, and also includes the late biodiversity scientist Tom Lovejoy, who is also credited with coining the term biodiversity. He sadly passed away while we were preparing the manuscript, and it will be his last posthumously published article. And here we've laid out the scaffolding of how a comparison on biodiversity impacts between land and sea mining could be considered, particularly around polymetallic nodules. Now, a lot of the debate around deep sea mining hinges on the use of the precautionary principle, which goes back to Agenda 21. That was the document that came out of the 1992 Earth Summit. However, the precautionary principle is not a scientific principle. It's a risk management principle, and it needs to be applied with great care with some kind of a systems-wide approach. And that is what IUCN, in fact, argued for in their document on how should policymakers use the precautionary principles. Unfortunately, they have been cornered and bullied into issuing statements around deep sea mining without really looking at the full systems-wide approach. And I say that as someone who has served on the World Commission on Protected Areas with IUCN. The other aspect of this is moratoria. It's been argued that we should have a moratorium on deep sea mining because we just don't know enough. Moratoria makes sense if you have much more time flexibility on what the ultimate goal is. So, for example, with gene drive technologies, there was an argument made for a moratorium, and it was in fact rejected because gene drive technologies could be used to eradicate mosquitoes that spread certain diseases. And the argument was made that we need to get rid of those kinds of ailments, and the cost benefit analysis for gene drive technologies comes out such that a moratorium would hinder that broader goal. A similar kind of argument can be made around deep sea mining if we are serious about meeting the Paris Agreement targets, which are time dependent. And then you have other technologies which are competing to meet the Paris targets, such as solar geoengineering. And I would argue that a moratorium does make more sense for those technologies, because if you look at the full risk profile and what we call unknowable unknowns, or we call known unknowns, you would see that that becomes a much bigger problem. Now, mineral governance is an essential part of this story, because with deep sea mining, we do have an organization, the International Seabed Authority, which was set up under the Law of the Sea Convention. Despite its imperfections, it provides at least an international governance mechanism around environmental and social performance of the sector. We do not have anything similar for terrestrial mining. Each country has its own policies, and there is a danger of a race to the bottom in many cases. So the governance argument is really important, and I would urge Eric Lipton, whose work as a journalist I have immense respect for, to consider that, uh, given the way in which his recent article had cast aspersions on the International Seabed Authority. Because despite its imperfections, it is the best thing we have for international mineral governance, because we don't even have that for terrestrial mining currently. Now, the other aspect of this is circular economy, and ultimately, we must all aim towards having a circular economy. And that's one of the things that has impressed me about deep sea mining, is that many of the private sector players involved in this are actually asking that we move towards a circular economy whereby batteries would be recycled, and these mining companies would then get into the recycling business and become material service providers rather than just miners. This is some work which we did with the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment some years ago, which highlights the challenge of signaling between downstream and upstream companies that work on the green transition. And what we argue for is a smart mineral enterprise development model, whereby you would have public private partnerships that would allow for much better signaling of innovation, and having this kind of mechanism for the role of government for environmental and social risk certification, also having a strategic stockpile, which would deal with some of the inefficiencies in the system and also address the geopolitical concerns that have come about in the critical metals debates. So this is something for further action. Recently, I've also been arguing for some international mechanism for having a mineral supply agreement, either through the International Renewable Energy Agency or the WTO or the G20, which brings together some of these geopolitical challenges around metal sourcing and finds a cooperative solution to them. Also, domestically, having a much more integrated approach to mineral sourcing through a reincarnation, perhaps, of the Bureau of Mines, which could be now called the Critical Materials Administration, bringing into account the circular economy and other mechanisms similar to JOGMEC or KIGAM, the Japanese and Korean agencies, which have a much broader mandate than what the USGS has, for example. And here are some references to publications that we've been working on in this regard recently. Recently, I've also published a book, Earthly Order, last year, which makes the argument for having a systems approach to managing planetary resources. And in that case, I'm donating all royalties also from this book for environmental education programs. And Soil to Foil, which does sort of a deep dive on aluminum as a metal that is often neglected in the importance it has for the green transition and how we should use it as a parable for broader questions of sustainability. Finally, I'd invite you to visit our website at University of Delaware, and also our podcast, A Rock and a Hard Place. Perhaps many of you might want to also be guests on this. And one of my graduate students, Tom Hale, hosts the podcast. So we look forward to further conversations with clean tech colleagues.